Welcome to the Social Workers radio talk show on WCDB Albany 90.9 FM with co-host Dr. Eric Hardiman and Alyssa Lotmore. Here at the Social Workers, we address issues important to our communities with social work students, alumni, and community partners as our guests.
As part of the University at Albany School of Social Welfare, we hope to take social work beyond the classroom and agency settings and directly to the public, because the public is the client. Catch us on air, online, and anytime.
Welcome to the Social Workers on WCDB Albany. My name is Eric. I'm here with Alyssa Lotmore. Welcome back, Alyssa.
It's great to be here, Eric, especially this year because it's the School of Social Welfare's 60th anniversary, and we are highlighting alums from past years.
We are. It's an exciting year. We get to take stock of everywhere the school's been and all the accomplishments of the school. And one of the ways we get to do that here on the Social Workers is by interviewing alumni and hearing, all of the incredible work and achievements and successes that our former students have had working out in the community. And we get to see what social workers actually do. We get to see the breadth of social work and the profession. We get to see the impact that people have on communities, that sometimes we don't hear about. And so this show gives us a nice opportunity to do that.
And I think our guest today is a great example of really what you can do with a social work degree that you might never have thought of. Yeah. So with all the wild weather that we've been having, it seems like there is a disaster every week that needs emergency response. Our guest is a social worker who works with that disaster response, has worked with FEMA. So Eric, maybe you can give a little preview of who we're going to be talking with today.
We are honored to be talking today with Anne Bink. Anne currently serves as the Director of Mitigation and Resilience at Innovative Emergency Management, or IEM, in the private sector, where she collaborates with state, tribal, territorial, and local governments to build resilience and in infrastructure in communities both before and after disasters. From 2021 through May 2024, she was the Associate Administrator of Response and Recovery at FEMA. She led a team of 12,000 staff to deliver national response and recovery operations. She oversaw a $200 billion portfolio of disaster recovery grants. She was also the Deputy Commissioner for Disaster Recovery for New York State from 2018 through 2021, where she oversaw a portfolio of over $20 billion in active disasters. During her tenure in New York, she secured 6 major disaster declarations and led New York's legacy disaster closeout effort, resulting in the closure of approximately 8,000 projects and 9 disasters. Anne first joined the New York State Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Services in 2016 and served as the Deputy Commissioner of Administration and Finance prior to her work in disaster recovery. Prior to that, she served in various leadership roles within the New York State Division of the Budget. Anne holds a Master of Social Work, a Master of Arts in Women's Studies, and a Bachelor of Arts, all from the University at Albany. She lives right here in the Capital Region in Loudonville with her partner, Laura, and their 4 children.
So let's take a listen to our interview with Anne Bink.
I'd like to officially welcome you, Anne. Welcome you to the Social Workers.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Thanks for being here. It's, Alyssa and I have been emailing and texting back and forth and just saying how excited we were that you were willing to be a guest on our show. You are really one of the graduates of the School of Social Work, Social Welfare, who has really accomplished so much. And it's often, my sense is, and we'll get into some of your work, and we'll get into what some of the challenges were and some of the successes have been. But it's work that I believe is often done behind the scenes. It's work that is not always recognized publicly, and people don't know always what goes into helping communities after disasters. But you've worked at the state level, you've worked at the federal level, you've done international work, you've really kind of covered all the all the bases in terms of disaster relief and recovery. And so that's just incredibly exciting. And we're honored that you have done all this work and that you're here on the show with us. So I guess let's just start off by kind of going backwards, and then we'll get to your current work. But I'm really curious how you got into social work in the first place. What was your journey like into this profession?
Yeah, so I started as a student, an undergrad student with a major in psychology. So I always knew I had an interest in that space. My last semester, I took 4.5 semesters to graduate, or 4.5 years to graduate undergrad. And that last semester was when 9/11 hit. So I remember being in the classroom in the lecture center at UAlbany when we got notice of what happened. And I remember that day very vividly, as we all do. And I think it crystallized in me and many around me, right? The duty to serve. I knew I was interested in psychology and social work. I also knew I was very interested in politics. And then 9/11, right? So this duty to serve, I think, really brought me forth. And one of the ways I thought I could do that was in social work. I wanted to major in I wanted to focus on macro, right? So policy level within the School of Social Welfare, knowing that it's kind of a unique focus that UAlbany has, and really take that love of the political and policy and refract that through social work to really, start my career.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, social work is, historically been political and it's been involved with the political domain, but at times we've veered away from it as a profession and we've gone more the clinical route and we've become healthcare providers. And sometimes social work is thought of as not political by its nature. But I'm one of those folks who thinks, as it sounds like you do as well, that it is, and that it's important to be engaged with and politics gets a bad rep too, but it's important to be engaged at that level too.
Yeah,
I feel like I have to.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I just say, and I feel like I have to rewrite. We were working on a slide for our new students to come in and look at the program, and it said, "What can you do with a career in social work?" I feel like I have to rewrite this and sort of add, "There's so much more that you can do." Looking at your resume and all that you've accomplished so far, your classes help prepare you for that. And I would like to know, sort of, you're talking about how you were inspired to go into social work and do that macro type work. And I just was curious how your classes help prepare you for the work that you're doing now.
Yeah, so it was a mix of classwork and some of the internship work, right? That kind of intensive work we do within nonprofit governmental partners, right? So that first year, I worked with Catholic Charities and I was in the child welfare system working on the prevention program. And as part of the prevention program, obviously, you're trying to keep families together. And it's crucial, deep work that really sticks with you. And as part of that work, I actually got the opportunity to go lobby for some of the programs that I cared about as well. Things like childcare, better supports through public assistance and other mechanisms that can help keep families together. Because we know in the public foster care system, what the profile looks like. And if families can stay together because of material resources, clearly in my role as a social worker, I wanted to advance that. But you look at that work and it's intensive, and the people who do it are heroes. Honestly, it's incredibly hard work, and it's grueling, and the outcomes aren't always there because it's hard work.
Right.
So it really helped me kind of zoom out and say, how do I change the policies that will help impact families? And I got to do that at the Division of the Budget. For a long time, I worked on the human services portfolio within the Division of Budget. And I was part of the team that, as part of the budget process, authorized kinship care. So basically paying monthly stipends to family members of children who would have otherwise entered the foster care system and been placed elsewhere. So it's just that kind of synergy that I think the social work program allowed me to really, really work through.
And we have faculty members now who are researching kinship care, and that's continued to be an interest of the School of Social Welfare. So that's great.
And that was my first internship. I was with Catholic Charities in their kinship care program for my BSW field placement.
Oh, that's fantastic. So I would love to talk to you more about that. I know it's not the topic of today's discussion, but I'd love to hear how it is being implemented and how it's working out.
So Anne, how did you go from, working with that with kinship care and Catholic charity? How did that move into, and you had this experience as I did too, being at UAlbany when 9/11 happened, but of being sort of interested in the aftermath of, large scale disasters, whether they be man-made or natural. Um, how did you kind of make that transition from, from doing sort of budget work and policy work and into disaster work?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there was no direct path to it. And I think,
Okay.
it's really recent that the emergency management field is really, having the kind of undergraduate, graduate degree level programs that didn't always exist, right? It's an emerging field. I think it's becoming more established. So
Yeah.
the field by definition is largely interdisciplinary, and I think it's one of the strengths. I think professionalizing makes sense too, but I think one of the strengths of the field is that critical thinking element and the interdisciplinary nature. Because with disaster work, it really matters the community with which you work, that you work within, but also the folks you're working with. So
Right.
for me, what drew
Right.
me to it was simply something new to learn and knowing I could leverage the skills that I have to help, right? I think being a social worker has allowed me to build bridges and connections with the nonprofit sector, with the philanthropic sector, with others throughout organizations in a way that I probably wouldn't have had I not had the education and experience I had.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you say that because we talk in classes in social welfare a lot about, or at least I do in my classes, try to have discussions around social workers as boundary spanners, that social workers are individuals who work kind of at those intersections of whether it's policy and practice, whether it's community and family, whether it's state and federal, or different organizations, different disciplines, different parts of the community. Social workers are often the people that kind of straddle those lines and connect the dots and are able to sort of zoom out and see the big picture and how things might connect versus professions that are, so narrowly defined, and they're wonderful professions and disciplines, but they work in their own zone a little more. And social work tends to be interdisciplinary and tends to look at sort of those intersections, which I think is a fascinating quality.
Yeah, and I think too, I mean, Jane Addams was a political activist, right? At her
Yeah.
heart, right? And the work she did was kind of that intersection between helping individuals and really driving social change. And one of the things she said that stuck with me throughout my career is the cure to the ills of democracy is more democracy, right? That's how I try to drive forward change, meaning I'm rarely the smartest person in the room. I'm surrounded by some of the smartest people in the field of emergency management and disaster recovery that exist, both in the state of New York and now, with my work at FEMA, and now certainly at IEM, driving it forward from the private sector perspective. And drawing people in and getting their opinions and thoughts, and ultimately me in a decision-making role, but benefiting from all of the intelligence in the room, democratizing the process, actually allowed us to move faster, right? So we would make decisions I'd have all my leadership in a room during big disasters at FEMA, and we would hash out the issues, we'd critically think through them, and as a team, we'd come up with solutions, right? And my decision didn't always, wasn't always the same as what the team came up with, or one side would agree with me and the other wouldn't, but we came to a conclusion together. And ultimately, at headquarters, we brought in the region and the field, so we were meeting their needs, right? During a big disaster, you almost have to shrink a bureaucracy to flat, right? In order to understand what's happening on the ground and get the resources to the field that are implementing the actions that are needed to stabilize the situation and ultimately help a community recover. So to me, that is directly related to the education received through the School of Social Welfare, as well as the second master's I received in the Women's Studies program, where I kind of dug into some of that social work philosophy that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah. Wow, it's amazing to hear you talk about this, because it's pulling together various threads for me, at least in my head, of kind of like I said at the outro, at the intro, the sort of, what are the behind the scenes kind of way, what happens behind the scenes when disasters hit, and who starts working together, and who comes to the table, and which organizations, but which people, and when do democracies, start to, and hierarchies get flattened, like you said, and it's all about the work getting done or getting decisions made. And sounds like you have had, it's really clear to me, you've had just a set of experiences in your career that many people don't have, and that haven't had the ability to, or the opportunity, I should say, to make a difference on such a large scale. I wonder, it's sort of a vague question, but if you have some thoughts about that, the scale and scope of your work. I mean, it's really, because you started, here at Catholic Charities in Albany, and at the University at Albany, and then it seems like as your careers developed, your scope has gotten bigger and bigger.
Yeah, it's true. And I think fundamentally what I've tried to do is shrink bureaucracies, right? So that folks that need help can get it on their worst day, right? And thinking of it in those terms, I worked with my core team, and I was appointed. I was an appointee of the Biden administration. And I worked with all career servants. They're called senior executive, SES. So all of my deputies and all of the direct reports through them were career, right? And that could have been a point of divide, but we just worked through all of the ideas that they already had. I worked through some of my priorities with them. We engaged together and came up with a strategic, list of initiatives under our strategic plan that the Administrator Criswell set, and then moved toward action. And underneath it all, one of the big things for me was always, how do I lift up the ideas of the team that's been here, will continue to be here well after I leave? And how do we embed the way of being into the organization so that when I leave, folks are still thinking about, how do I shrink this bureaucracy to give people the help they need? And the truth is, that team is so committed, right? Even when it gets really hard, and we're going to talk about disasters and how hard they can be, those principles have been embedded throughout, and now they're continuing to do that work. I still hear from them when they hit a milestone that we had set as a target. I still hear from them because they're proud and they know they're making a difference to people and communities. So
yeah. I mean, one of the things that I guess that I hear you saying is that those principles and values, I'm not sure if you use the word values, so I apologize if I'm adding that in, but certainly the principles of reducing bureaucracy, and of listening to stakeholders, and of kind of hearing, the voices of experience and wisdom in the room, and then making decisions, and the importance of collaboration, and all those kind of principles and core values. I agree. I think they're embedded in social work, but I think they're also really critical in a time of disaster, because if you don't have those principles as a foundation, I think it's probably much easier to get lost in the chaos. Just an observation more than a question.
Yeah.
But how does that connect? Like you said, everyone's sort of coming together because it is a disaster situation, but having that social work perspective, how has it been to navigate with colleagues who aren't social workers? So do you feel like you can add, having that social work background, do you feel that it adds to what you were able to accomplish, or is there any type of pushback, or what is the normal situation when you're dealing with so many people from different professions to try to respond to a disaster?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's no doubt there was tension, right? I think there are times when there's going to be tension between styles, just pure styles. There's going to be tension between disciplines. But there's also this, folks need to feel like they're heard, right? And a lot of times new folks come in with a list, right? They want to execute. I did that, right? I did have a list, but I also listened and changed and adjusted the list and reprioritized and restacked based upon what the team provided. I started with trust. I started with trusting the team, and 9 times out of 10, that team trusted me because of that. But there are hard conversations and there are differences of opinion. I think the skills, though, I learned, you just kind of calm down, right? And you sit back and you listen, even if somebody is getting concerned, worked up, you start to just listen and go back to those kind of clinical skills you learned, right? Which are helpful, and try to get to the core of the issue. So it goes from the very broad to the very like individual, and getting to know folks one-on-one. We're all type A, right? We're in this crazy field because we're all type A, right? Where you sacrifice a lot of your personal life and time to be there for the nation on their hardest days. So if we didn't have those hard conversations, I would have actually been a little bit concerned that maybe my folks didn't care as much as they should, right? I want to get into it and want to understand where they're coming from.
I love how you mentioned that, because it's sort of that, so many times students say like, oh, I'm either micro or a macro. And here you talk about how they all intertwine. You still need, even doing macro work, you still need those clinical skills, those micro level skills to be able to navigate and, listen to the individuals to help make that macro level change. So I really like how it sort of comes together and shows how social work is all of that, all the different levels of social work, micro, meso, macro, it all comes together to make you the social worker that you are.
And I think, to your point, I've only been effective because I've gotten out into the field after disasters and talked to survivors one-on-one, right? So there is this through line where if you don't hear on the ground what's happening, it's very hard to change policy in service of the people you're serving, right? Meaning it is very easy for a DC-based organization to make rules and make policies that make it easier for a DC organization to run. And what that means over time is that it's much harder for survivors to recover because they're dealing with our language and our terms as a federal agency with a huge bureaucracy. So can you turn that around 180 degrees in 2.5 years? No, but you can set the conditions to continue to advance and shrink that bureaucracy so people can recover. So it is both. It's always both. It's macro and micro. If you're setting policy without understanding the micro conditions that exist on the ground, then I'd argue you might not be serving the communities that you're developing policy for.
It's so important to listen to people on the ground, and I think that's a really important piece of what you're saying, and obviously one that connects with social work as a profession, but that importance of talking to people who are impacted within a community. And I think as folks sometimes, particularly in the current discourse, will criticize disaster relief efforts, it's important to remember that disaster relief, when it's done right and when it does take into account the voices and the experiences of people who are in the greatest need or who are most heavily impacted at the center of the sort of bullseye, if you will, of kind of need, have and I say that sort of as a graphic, the people that need the most help and the most assistance are the ones who need to be listened to. And so I'm really glad to hear you say that, and to hear someone at your level and the sort of scope, as I said, that you have professionally, to acknowledge that is just really valuable for folks to hear. So just real quick, or go ahead. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
I'm just going to reintroduce listeners. If you're just tuned in, we're talking with Anne Bink, who's a graduate of the School of Social Welfare at the University of Albany. She's got an undergraduate degree, 2 masters from the University of Albany. But right now she's serving as Director of Mitigation and Resilience at Innovative Emergency Management. She's also worked for FEMA. She's worked for New York State. She's got all kinds of, and I went into some of the list earlier, just incredible work history and achievements and accomplishments. But if you just tuned in, I hope you're enjoying the conversation. We're going to continue talking with Anne Bink. And, one of the things I heard you say maybe allude to and I want to ask about is the importance of mission, the importance of sort of knowing what your purpose is. And sometimes I think in social work that can be a little vague. You know, it can be like social workers are expected to fix the world. They're expected to make people's lives better, but that's really vague. And so having a very specific mission and purpose, I think is really, really important after disasters. So I guess I'm wondering if you could talk about that. Like, what's the role of mission for you?
Yeah, I mean, so FEMA as an organization, very simple mission, helping people before, during, and after disasters.
Mm,
And to me, and my role now as well, working on mitigation and resilience, it's how do you drive a large bureaucracy and a group of very dedicated professionals, right, toward a singular mission. So when I think about it, I'm thinking about how do you convene and then harness, right, into uh, basically a singular unified effort. And that can be hard, right? Because it's a diffuse organization. In many cases, when it comes to disaster response and recovery, you're dealing with all levels of government. You're dealing with nonprofits. You're dealing with philanthropic, private sector, right, to
mhm.
stabilize communities. It's harrowing. And I think the thing that inspired me so much, and then hopefully I harnessed even more, is really honing that effort into making sure we're at the service of communities and hearing their priorities and then delivering for them. Knowing frankly that we are at a different time in history, that maybe historical
Yeah,
trends when it comes to weather and threats does not apply to the future, right? And how do we
right.
help communities make that pivot? And it's very hard but important work.
There's also, and I think I picked up on the word mission also because so you've got the organizational mission and the purpose of disaster relief and recovery, but there's also a personal element to it too, I would imagine, which, you mentioned that, this work comes at some cost and that for you, that probably, I'm guessing, but has meant a lot of travel, without planning and sort of suddenly an event happens and you have to go. So can you talk about that a little bit about sort of your personal um, approach to mission, and sort of how that guides you a little bit, I guess.
Yeah. So, yes, you are absolutely correct. In my role and really throughout disaster response and recovery exists at all levels this mission to serve. And it means getting a call in the middle of the night and getting on a plane and heading to the impacted community. Right.
Mm,
And for me, that meant, putting the burden on my partner to help with my four stepkids, right, that are at various school ages, right, and all of their extracurriculars and all that. So it becomes almost a mission at the family level for everyone who does this work because no one could do it without support around them
mm,
because of how intensive it is, not only physically but mentally, right? I've talked before that trauma, secondary trauma in this field and many other associated fields becomes an occupational hazard, right? And one
yeah.
of the things I try to do in my role is really focus in on the mental health aspect and how do we provide supports to our field staff in a way that not only gird them against secondary trauma, but then afterwards provide them support when they've seen and heard things that are truly difficult, right? And they're
Yeah.
helping, which helps. But again, we ended up building in more mental health supports in all the regional offices that deploy to field offices to meet responders where they're at. We
Mhm.
had our psychiatrist at the headquarters level deploy with our um, urban search and rescue teams during the Lahaina fires, right?
Mm,
I was there within the first 3 days and it was harrowing. The human remains recovery, the toll that takes, the destruction, the smell in the air, right? So we just embedded mental health supports with that team because the work they do is so important and so solemn and so harrowing that they needed it. So in my
yeah.
role, I try to work more and more to build in that those supports because I think, if you look at the history of emergency management, that might not have been as
Yeah.
prioritized as we're starting to see it prioritized today.
And also, I would imagine, so there's the secondary trauma for relief workers of witnessing and helping and hearing stories and seeing the after effects. But there's also, I would imagine, the sort of maybe bigger picture stress of feeling overwhelmed. Like, and I would imagine there's times at the federal level, and I guess I'd like to hear you, maybe I'm guessing here, but there's times when it might be really easy to fall prey to feeling overwhelmed and feeling like, you're putting out a fire here, you're putting out a fire there, or you're, coordinating some disaster relief immediately following a hurricane. But then there's another one that happens over here, and then you've got to move and sometimes leave communities that still need ongoing help. So how do and it can be you personally, or just how do you think about that sense of overwhelm that can happen in disaster relief?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think for me, I channeled it into the work to support our field teams, right? Because to me, they're
Mm.
really at the heart of all the work we do. And they're the ones who are going to be able to deliver and not deliver based upon how we develop policies, how we implement the processes, shrink that bureaucracy so they can make a difference in people's lives on their worst days. So one thing I worked on with my field operations directorate was flipping the availability model for our thousands of reservists that exist throughout the country. So
Hmm.
instead of them saying when they're not available, they tell us when they are, right? They used to fear that if they didn't put in a lot of availability, that they'd be at the back of the list and never get deployed, right?
Okay.
So we flipped it to empower them to say, no, you tell us, right? And when you're available, we will use you or not, right? Depending on the nature of the circumstances. But that's all to say, paired with some of the mental health supports I put in place during my tenure at FEMA, that was all designed to really wrap our arms around the incident workforce, right? The folks that come in and don't work full time to come in when there's a disaster, and the folks that, even though they're part time, have worked years in the field. There's enough
Mm.
disaster activity that if reservists want to work, they can. And how do we protect them? Because when am in the field, I would hear, "I've been to Maria, I've been to Katrina, I've been through Laura, I've been," right, over and over. And that's where it really crystallized for me. We have to do everything we can from a mental health perspective as well as a physical health
Right.
perspective to support
Right.
them.
And I guess I'm curious, you mentioned the reservists. And like I said, I do volunteer work. I've never done a deployment yet, just because I do more of the virtual mental health. But for those who are interested in becoming a volunteer or helping in some of these disasters, what are the different avenues that people could do that?
Sure. So there are several. USA.gov is a website where you can see what job postings are available from FEMA directly if you wanted to sign up to be a reservist and deploy to support disaster response and recovery efforts. You could also volunteer through the Red Cross,
Mm.
through the United Way, through national voluntary organizations assisting in disasters, National VOAD. There is a whole structure and a whole
Yeah.
ecosystem of disaster work that exists. Team Rubicon is another one. So depending
Mm.
on how you'd want to get involved, and virtual deployments are actually a great one too, if you don't necessarily have the time or ability to deploy to the field to help support this work. There's plenty of opportunities, unfortunately, because the pace of disasters continues to hasten.
And that is one thing I just wanted to say from my experience. I was a little hesitant to sign up with the Red Cross at first, but I was like, oh my gosh, I can't, I have a newborn. I can't deploy, but I wanted to do something as I was watching things on the news, and they work with you. Like they say, here's some training. You can do this online. Here's extra training you can have. Here's how we prepare you to go into one of these, situations. And if you can't leave your house, if you can't hop on a plane within 2 days, you can do virtual work. You can respond to local work, house fires, things like that. So I was really pleased to see how well the organizations work with you, at least in my experience, to still have the volunteers be able to serve in a way that fits into what they can actually do.
That's great. And I think the other thing too I'd want to highlight is, preparation for disaster starts at home. I don't think there's any
Mm.
community that is immune to disaster impacts like we're seeing with these rapidly intensifying storms. You get,
Yeah.
unprecedented storm surge, but you're getting inland impacts well within the country and well beyond
Yeah.
landfall, right? So we saw it with Ida. I was in New York when Hurricane Ida, which basically hit New York City as a post-tropical depression, right? A rainstorm,
Right.
but a massive one that overwhelmed systems. So I'd say not only to volunteer if that's something you're interested in, but also prepare at home, right? There's things you can do to have go kits,
Hmm.
food and water supply, other things that really prepare you if you can't be reached for several days, like we're seeing in some of the impacted areas related to Helene.
Yeah. Yeah. I was thinking about Asheville that, folks talked about Asheville as being safe from, weather related disasters, a place that was, not to be impacted. And then clearly that's not the case, that we have to think a little bit differently about who should prepare for and how communities should prepare for potential disasters. And we're seeing climate change. We're seeing, increasing storms. We're seeing increasing weather events. And again, that leads me back to the sort of question about feeling overwhelmed, that there's just, it feels almost overwhelming turning on the news and watching and hearing about disasters. We're certainly hearing about war and the disasters happening abroad, sort of man-made disasters of that nature, but then also weather-related disasters here. And it seems to me it's so complex that there's this, there's the long-term picture of how do we prepare communities. There's the immediate picture of how we provide relief when something does happen, and then the actual trauma and there's just a lot to think about. And I'm so thankful that you're there doing this work and sort of providing this level of guidance. So don't really have a question in there, but I guess it just really strikes me that this is not easy work.
Yeah. It certainly is not. And it's, in shifting into a mitigation and resilience position now with IEM,
Yeah.
the idea is how do we take what are unprecedented circumstances when it comes to the intensity, severity, expansive nature, and
Yeah.
haste and pace of these disasters, and where I see the hope, right, and where I put my energy is how do we mitigate against these things? How do we harden our communities so they're stronger than before the storm? And hopefully we can mitigate some of those risks before the storm even hits, right? And
Yeah.
I think that's where I focus my effort and energy, because that's where we could truly see a difference. I worked on post Sandy resilience work when I was in New York, and really spent a lot of time at FEMA working on, working with communities that were impacted by disasters and leveraging the dollars that exist to rebuild to support more resilient measures, elevating structures, moving them out of floodplains, creating flood walls, right? All of these things that we know will help against the impacts of extreme weather. And right now, only about 1/10 of all the funding to rebuild after disasters goes toward actions that would actually make your community safer. They almost all go toward building it back the way it was. We're not in the world that was anymore. So really, that's where my effort is focused in my new role, and has always been throughout my career, because the more we can protect communities against their biggest risks, the more resilient they will be.
Yeah. It's also an interesting time right now because, like we said, there are increasing number of weather related events and climate change and disasters happening around the globe, as you put it. But also, it's a time of politicization of disaster relief and people starting to have public conversations and conversations in the public arena around how much resources should go to disaster preparation and rebuilding, and some of those conversations get used in ways that are not always positive. And I guess I'm curious to hear you talk about, so you've worked for the federal government, you've worked for New York State government, and now you're in the private sector. What do you see as sort of that intersection between the political and the the rest of the work around disaster relief and preparedness?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think what I want to start with is some experiences I've had in the big disasters. The big disasters, even when an election is not imminent, presidential election is not imminent, like a month from now, I've seen in the Lahaina fires in Maui, an intensive misinformation campaign occurring, right? Some is misinformation spread because you hear something from a neighbor and it's bad info and you put it on Facebook. But we found out later a large chunk of it was Chinese state actors trying to undermine confidence in the US government. And what better way to undermine the confidence in the US government than to undermine FEMA during a disaster, right? If you look at what happened, you know, after Hurricane Katrina, there is no doubt there was an erosion in the confidence of the federal government. And if they can exploit any pathway, right, and social media being one of them, in a big incident, they will. The train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, right? Russian actors likely performing work on behalf of the state of Russia also contributed to misinformation. So FEMA is really at the heart of a nation state geopolitical effort to undermine confidence in the nation and its government. And that is really scary because you're not talking about natural disasters versus, you know, man-made, human-made threats. You're talking about the two together, and the contested space is social media, right? So that's where I'd say, you know, for any disaster survivors and really anyone kind of witnessing what's happening, even if you're not impacted by Helene, you know, make sure you're letting folks know to look to reputable sources for information. There is so much misinformation and disinformation out there, some of which is just passing along false information from a neighbor, but a lot of it we'll probably find out again are nation state actors trying to sow discord 30 days before an election. So, you know, I can't stress that enough, that it impairs recoveries and services being provided to survivors because of those actions that are taken. So it's really incumbent upon all of us to talk with our friends and neighbors and talk with the larger communities that no, FEMA is not using eminent domain and taking over land. No, they're not just providing $750 to survivors. No, they do have enough money to you know, respond to this disaster and another one should it strike, right? And the last one isn't, again, it's not nation states coming at us. That is our own internal political dynamic that we're experiencing in the US now. So lots going on.
It's got to be frustrating to be in the middle of that sometimes and feel like, you know, this work is complex, it's comprehensive, it's, you know, sprawling, challenging, difficult on its own. And then you've got outside entities that are making it even more difficult by, you know, complicating things, complicating the public's awareness of them or the public's understanding, you know, whether it's by sowing, you know, misinformation and doubt or, you know, actively working to undermine efforts. It's got to be, I would imagine, frustrating.
It sure is, and I have to say, the FEMA administrator, Deanne Criswell, has been in North Carolina, has been in the impacted area since the storm hit, from Florida through North Carolina, and she's putting out videos, right, to debunk some of these, you know, misinformation campaigns, to show no, FEMA's here, they're on the ground, as are all the state and local partners and nonprofit partners that help make this disaster stabilize, right, and then move toward that recovery. So. But it takes all of us, right? It takes all of us to really, you know, question, hey, where are you getting this information from? Hey, are you sure that's true? Let's look and go to a reputable, peer-reviewed source. Because right now, you know, the social media space is a bit of the Wild West.
Indeed it is. Yeah. So I guess, you know, we'll probably need to wind down here in a minute. It's just, I could talk for hours about this just because I'm so fascinated by the topic and have done some work in the area too. So I'm also, you know, have a personal interest in it. But I'm really curious about your shift to the private sector. Can you talk a little bit about sort of how that's differed from working for the government and sort of how you see your contribution both now and in the future, you know, from a different perspective?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And part of it, frankly, was to get some more balance in my personal life, right? I've been working in the disaster recovery and response space now for many years. And in order to kind of step back and take another look at what I want to do to add value in the landscape, it became clear to me I wanted more time to think about strategy and really deep thinking around policy and the field and how to drive forward some of the important changes that we need to make in regard to rebuilding in a different way, in a way that meets the moment. So part of it was certainly personal and wanting to make sure I could go to more of my kids, extracurriculars and, be with my family more. But there's another part that the disaster activity is so voluminous right now that most of the time at FEMA, our work was innovating through disasters. So we would make policy changes based upon the conditions on the ground in real time, and then try to expand those to improve everything. And in this role, I'm able to step back a little bit, strategize, think more deeply, and then try to provide value to the, state and local, tribal, territorial partners that we serve. And the truth is, the private sector, just like the philanthropic nonprofit, is part of that fabric of disaster response and recovery. We all rely on each other, especially in the big incidents, to all kind of rally around the impacted communities and support their stabilization and then their recovery. So I see myself as being on the same team, just maybe in a different position, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It does. Alyssa?
No, you've just listening to you this whole time, you've done such amazing work and are continuing to do work in this field. And it just shows how much you can do with a social work degree, how it's not just, oh, you're sitting in an office with clinical, working one-on-one with individuals. There's so much you can do, and you are a great example of that. So as we wrap up here, I want to bring it back to the beginning when you were in the school social welfare. This is our 60th anniversary. Do you have any good memory or a favorite class or something that happened at the school social welfare that you kind of want to share as we talk about, 60 years of the school being here? Do you have any good memory?
Yeah, I have a lot of good memories from the school social welfare. I mean, I enjoyed Dr. Hardiman's class tremendously. I've enjoyed all of the classes, right? Because a lot of it was discussion based. So for the most part, it wasn't, a professor teaching, it was learning together. And I don't know if I have a specific moment, but I do just recall and draw from the fact that we all learned from each other. Like the school social welfare for me wasn't a bunch of kids straight out of college into a grad program. It was a broad intersection of folks across different geographical areas, ethnicities, different experiences. And I think all that together really solidified for me how much we all learn and how much better we learn when we learn together. So that's what I really take from the school of social welfare. And, I think I'm a better practitioner for it.
And certainly when you've talked about your sort of your own values and principles around democracy and increasing democracy and reducing bureaucracy, listening to communities, listening to experts, learning from, learning with, sort of learning in collaboration. Those ideas resonate with what you were just talking about from the classroom. That, and I think we do try to do that at the School of Social Welfare, to try and, offer discussion and also give students a chance to articulate their ideas. And, part of, and maybe I'm a little aside here topically, but part of what Alyssa and I love about doing this show is just talking about social work in the public sphere, because social workers are not always adept at, singing their own praises or talking about their profession. It's more of a doing profession. It's more of a profession that's behind the scenes. You get the work done, you help a client, you're in the office, you're in the field, you're in the community. You're just doing. You're not talking about why you're doing it or how you're doing it or, what you're doing exactly. And so we really enjoy, I think I can speak for both of us, that we enjoy hearing people articulate what's important about social work and what's valuable about it in more of a public discourse kind of way, so that folks can can think of social workers not just as clinicians or therapists or, mini psychiatrists, but that, or psychologists, but that social workers are actually out there helping communities after disasters and helping our nation, think about how we mitigate, situations that are horrific and that, involve loss of life and loss of neighborhoods and loss of communities. Some places, that will take years and years and years to rebuild. And rebuild isn't even the right word, that they've changed for good. I know some of the work that I did in Indonesia following the tsunami of 2004, right when you were, graduating. I was able to go over there and help out after the tsunami, and, entire coastlines that were changed and villages that were no longer there. So it's not a matter of rebuilding because it's all gone. And so then it's a completely different scenario. So all of which is to say that social workers are doing so much more than people give us credit for. And it's not about getting credit, but it's about sort of having a larger discussion around the power of social work and around what graduates with a social work degree might end up doing. And again, if you've just tuned into the social workers, you're listening to WCDB Albany, and this is, where we talk with lots of folks interested in social work. And we've been talking with Anne Bink, who's a graduate of the School of Social Welfare at the University of Albany, is currently Director of Mitigation and Resilience at Innovative Emergency Management in the private sector. But as she told us, she's also worked for FEMA. She's worked for Homeland Security. She just had an incredible, there's so much we could have talked about. And it brings me, and I'm sorry for being so long-winded here, but it brings me to another point, which is that I really think our students would love to hear from you. And we'll try to publicize this episode, but I would love to get you to come talk to students too. And we have at various times, we've had disaster related courses at the school. We probably didn't back when you were a student, because that was just immediately post 9/11. And they're not offered, unfortunately, all the time, but some years we do offer disaster relief courses and disaster preparedness. So, we'd love to get you connected with that. We also, at the University of Albany, we have, a whole department, the School of Emergency Preparedness, Homeland Security, and Cybersecurity, which is a pioneering, program for undergraduates and graduate students in this space. So I think folks could really learn a lot from you, Anne.
I'd be happy to meet with students at any time. I'd be thrilled to give back. I've gotten a lot from U Albany and the School of Social Welfare, so count me in.
Well, I just want to thank you for coming on today. This has been an excellent episode. I'm so glad you agreed to come on. When I reached out, I was like, I hope she will see my email and actually open it up. So thank you so much for coming on. This has been an excellent episode, and we will definitely share widely.
And it's so great
to be here.
Great to see you again, and it's great to see former students and graduates from the University of Albany just being so successful. I mean, you really, I hope you take the time to kind of sit back and look at your career and realize that you've accomplished. I mentioned to Alyssa this morning, I said, this Anne is one of those graduates who makes the rest of us kind of wonder what we've done with our time. And I mean that as a positive, that you really have accomplished so much. And impacted communities and impacted people and neighborhoods and our whole country in a way that not everybody gets a chance to do. So thank you, really sincerely for all that work, because it's so important.
And thank you both. What you're doing to amplify social work and really show that, the career options are limitless is a really big deal. So I really appreciate this conversation. I thought it was awesome.
Alyssa, any news about anything else, upcoming shows, anything you want to close out with?
Just stay tuned, because we have a lot of great episodes coming up. So here's to our 60th anniversary.
And where can folks find episodes if they want to listen to archived episodes? I know, but I want to ask the question so listeners can hear.
You can go on to the albany.edu/CIHS/SSW, because we are now under the College of Integrated Health Sciences. So you can find it on our website or the social workers radio talk show.simplecast.com.
And on social media, I think we've got presence in all these places. So if you do a search, online for the Social Workers Radio Show, you'll find old episodes in various places. And we appreciate all of our listeners. Thanks for tuning in to WCDB Albany. This has been the Social Workers.